Welcome to the Unconsumed podcast. I'm here with my good friend, Dallas Jenkins. Dallas is a producer, director, all of the above when it comes to media and movies. You've done a ton of cool things, and we'll get into that in a second. But when I first met you, Dallas, we were in Chicago playing in a basketball league together, and I had no idea who you were or what you did or anything. But now that I do know, you're a pretty stout basketball player for a creative guy. Do you ever hear that?
Kind of. I mean, in the league that you and I were playing in, we were two of very few white guys, so I think that's why we were guarding each other. And, we were the slow guys who could keep track of each other, I suppose. I was actually an athlete before I was into media. I mean, I've always liked movies and television,
right,
and whatnot. But I was going to be a sports broadcaster or an athlete all growing up. I was obsessed with sports growing up, and I think, interestingly enough, for the purposes of your show, I think the beginnings of some of my entrepreneurial mindset began even through sports. I was always exploring, always curious. I was reading the Chicago Tribune sports page literally every day, starting at age 6.
Okay.
I read it, from page 1 to the last page, and always studying, always really into it. And even though I was an athlete, and I was a pretty good athlete, I was actually much more interested in the general manager side of things.
Okay.
Trades and strategy. And I think that's what actually limited me in my sports ability, was that I didn't actually go as much on instinct.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the best athletes are just out there purely guttural, and I was always a thinker. And so I think I make a better coach and general manager than I do an athlete. But to answer your question, yes, when I was in college, my intramural basketball team was called the Choir Boys, because it was made up of all guys from the choir and we ended up winning the league.
Wow.
And that was like one of the great moments of my life, because people underestimated us, because we were all coming from the music or the media side of the college, and we were able to surprise some people.
That is really funny. I would not take kindly to losing to the Choir Boys. I'm not going to lie to you.
Right. No. And we for sure, again, a good marketing strategy. We doubled down on our strengths and what people were thinking of us. So naming the Choir Boys gave us, I think, an edge by causing people to go into it thinking we were soft.
That's really funny. It reminds me, when I met you, I was fresh out of my college basketball career, and I had spent, just to give it some frame, like when I was in junior high and high school, I was like, you're very good at those levels. And then once you go to college, you're all of a sudden the worst guy. And and that's what I thought. And the level of athlete just goes through the roof, and you're doing anything you can to keep up. And then when I got out of that environment and entered into like the recreational type of basketball that we were playing, like you must have hated me, because I was full nuclear every time we were playing basketball. And it took me just as long to turn that instinct on coming into it, coming into that college frame. It took me just as long to turn it off after. And so every time I meet someone that I played basketball with in that time, I say, I'm sorry, I've grown up, things have changed. But that's just the nature of the beast, right?
Yeah, and I find that's true in life and in business.
Mm-hmm.
I think confidence is, 80% of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that when you walk into a room and you feel confident and comfortable, you're funnier. I think your brain is working quicker, and so you're coming up with ideas faster. You're standing up a little bit straighter.
Yeah.
And I found that in sports, when I was confident, I literally played twice as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a couple times, even in the league that you and I played in together, after you left, I actually got progressively less contributing. I became less of a contributor, because the league, these kids were in their early 20s. They were so fast, and I was in good shape, and I could keep up speed-wise, but the game itself was going faster than, I couldn't see the basket as well. I didn't have a good sense of, my court sense was off.
Right.
Just tentative. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's how I am when I'm in meetings or in certain scenarios where When
Right.
I feel like I'm the funniest guy in the room, I become funnier. I'm thinking of good things to say that much more and that much faster. And then when I'm around guys who I think are funnier than me or sharper than I am,
Yeah.
it makes me less sharp. I'm slower to the jump. And that's why I think, I mean, this is a cliche, but sports are such a metaphor for life.
They are. Yeah. I call that, I've identified this in myself, and maybe I'm calling it something different, but I call it a little bit of like an inferiority complex.
Sure.
Or if I walk in a situation and I think I'm worse, I'm going to be worse for sure. Like you don't even need to even, play the game. Like chalk it up as, hey, we lost. And I had already walked into that situation understanding that. So it was mood anyways.
Right. And now if I think that I may end up doing that, or I may walk into a room and be a little bit more tentative than normal, I'll consciously force myself to, chest up, shoulders back.
Dominant physical position. Is that what you're drawing on?
Well, yeah, sure. But even just
Okay.
walking in and coming up with, like, I'll prepare maybe something to say right at the beginning, and I don't intend to be that way for the whole meeting, and
Right.
interview or whatever it is. But even when I've done interviews, like I remember I did an interview on Fox News once,
Mm-hmm.
and it was my first national interview, and I was a little bit nervous, and so all I did was prepare my first line, and it was funny and it was sharp, and once that was out of the way, everything else was spontaneous and authentic. But just having those first 10 seconds prepared, I think stimulated my brain, and all these books behind me, I've got a few of them on the brain that support this thesis, which is that, you can convince your brain that you're more confident than you are.
Yeah. Well, can you throw us a title so we can check that out in more depth?
Well, I've got a book called The Brain That Changes Itself.
Okay.
One of the most, I think if there's about 5 books that out of the hundreds that I've read that I force on people more than any of them, The Brain That Changes Itself is in that top 5. It's primarily about people who are special needs or brain injuries or whatever, but it has a lot to say about just in general how you can convince your brain. Talks a lot about even things like phantom pain, like why is it that when someone literally doesn't even have an arm,
right,
or nerve endings, they actually feel pain for years. Why that is. It talks to you about how powerful the brain is. And then, of course, the book that I'm guessing a lot of your viewers and listeners have checked out is called The Power of Habit.
Okay.
And that's a very popular book. The Power of Habit, I think, is life-altering. It's all about how we overthink sometimes the notion of addiction. And really what we're thinking of when we say addiction, we're talking more about habits and how the habits in our lives can dictate what our lives turn out to be, and how we actually get caught up in bad habits, how we can actually correct those by forcing good habits. So the power of habit is essential, and there's it's a lot to do with the brain and how our brains operate.
Yeah. Okay. That's very cool. Appreciate you doing that, because a lot of guys on the spot wouldn't have 2 great reads for you to track down a previous comment. So let's bring it back to you. You have had tremendous success in the film industry, and it's, obviously you come from it a little bit. Would you describe a little bit about how you got into film, or like what your rationale for going into this was in the first place? Because you did mention that sports broadcasting piece, and I had not heard that before.
Yeah. So I was going to be a sports broadcaster. That was my plan all the way up until high school. My dad, who's a very well-known author, at least his book series is well-known. He wrote the Left Behind books, which have sold 70 million copies and written over 190 books in his life. And he's a big movie buff. So he got me into movies. When I saw the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in high school, it changed my life. I instantly thought, that's the kind of thing I want to do. If I can arouse the same kind of emotion and passion that movie's arousing in me, I could impact the world.
Wow. And
so when I got to college, even though I went to college initially as a broadcasting major, I shifted to communications and theater. So I was getting into that pretty hardcore in college. Around that time, the Left Behind books started to take off, and there was a company that wanted to make them into movies. And so I went to work at that company as just a low-level assistant. So right out of college, I went and worked as like a guy at the bottom of the barrel in the company, and just was, the guy running errands and delivering a FedEx package at the airport at 10:30 at night. And, so while I just kind of slowly worked my way up that company, by the time they were getting ready to make a movie, the first Left Behind movie, my dad's books had done so well, he actually had some financial resources to do some things. And we could tell that the movie that was going to be made based on Left Behind wasn't going to be very good. So my dad and I kind of started our own thing. And we saw that in all of our meetings in Hollywood that we were having over the years, there was a lot of people who talked about making movies, but not a lot of people who were actually making them.
Okay.
And so we figured if we just made one right out of the gate, that would put us ahead of the competition, or at least raise some eyebrows. And so right out of the
And
gate,
how old are you at this point?
I was 25.
25. Okay.
So 25, we made, I produced my first film, which was called Hometown Legend. And the financial resources to do it were, I don't know if you want to use the term lucky, in the sense that my father, who had been working, his whole life and had finally kind of broken through as an author and had a lot of success. So the financial resources to do it for me were lucky in the sense that they came from my dad. But, 90% of movies never see the light of day.
Right.
And so we still had to make a movie that people wanted to watch, and that was going to end up getting distribution. So we made Hometown Legend. It was picked up by an amazing opportunity by Warner Brothers.
Right.
So they distributed it around the world, and that's kind of how I got my start. And that was back in 2000, 2001.
Okay. And then since then, you've had this, you're 25 for this. And I always like to focus in on that term right at the beginning, where there was no guarantee for any success later on. You're working at a company delivering FedEx packages at 10:30 at night. And I think one thing that really hits my generation really hard, and I'm technically a millennial here, is that we, as a group, don't think that we ever need to do that. And so as one individual in that group, I'd say, yes, you absolutely have to do that, because you'll get to see all of the things that happen. And yeah, you might be technically beneath you or not worth what your college admission ticket cost you, but this is your entry into the space. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's two reasons for it. One, it's in many ways you don't have a choice unless you just go ahead and start your own business, which of course is risky, and I would argue would end up proving your point, which is, so let's say you don't have much of a choice but to get a low-level job and to work your way up.
Right.
Or let's say you do have a choice and you just decide to start your own company. Well, the lack of experience at the lower levels goes to your point, which is you're going to miss out on so much growth, because it's not linear. Like you can't fake the growth that you experience from doing it at the lower levels. And you can't read your way through it. Every book that I've read behind me only served what was 10 times more impactful to me when I was also experiencing a lot of the things that I was reading about. So I would actually argue that a lot of my work ethic and my ability to solve problems and do things that aren't fun began all the way back at 12 years old, when I would go down to my uncle and aunt's farm in central Illinois and spend 3 weeks walking cornfields for 8 hours a day, pulling tassels out.
What are tassels?
So to grow corn, the male rows grow these tassels that have seeds all over them, and the seeds sprout into the female corn, and they grow seed corn. And so
I did not know they had them gendered by rows. Is that that's true? Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so actually the female corn actually also grows these things, but you need to pull them out so that they can be more receptive to the actual breeding, to use for lack of a better term, that you're doing. And so
interesting.
You're not going to get good corn, and you're not going to get the proper corn unless you're actually manipulating the male rows and the female rows. And so anyway, I would literally walk for 8 hours a day in June heat, the middle of Illinois, pulling tassels out of every corn stalk that I was walking, and I did that 3 years in a row for 3 weeks at a time at 12, 13, and 14 years old. Probably, I'm sure, violating some child labor laws, but
what of it?
I always say I make movies for a living, and I do media for a living, but I learned how to work on a farm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think all of those experiences are absolutely invaluable, whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you're starting at the bottom of a company.
So let me ask you this. You created this first movie at 25. You can call it lucky or unlucky on how you got the funds to do it. Quite frankly, I think funds are pretty available for people that can prove that they can do something.
Sure.
But would you say that the time you spent working on the initial company's movie set helped you? Well, let's rephrase that. Do you think that it was absolutely imperative that you did that, or do you know now that with all the success that you've had, that you could have gone straight to that first thing and maybe have been 4 years ahead of schedule if you had made Hometown Legend at 21 or 22?
Oh gosh, I wouldn't have been able to make Hometown Legend at 21 by any means. I had to, when I was working at this company and I was working my way up slowly,
Mm-hmm.
Partially just because I had a lot to learn, and I was also going somewhat slowly because I think even at that age I was a little lazy. I think I was actually somewhat similar to a lot of the students I see now who come out of college,
Right.
not ready to work. And even though I had a good work ethic instilled in me by my father, I think I just and I had been a really hard worker. When I got my first kind of full-time job at 16,
Mm-hmm.
Blockbuster Video, I was a really hard worker. And then I think I got a little bit entitled for whatever reason. And then, so anyway, long story short, as I was working my way up, I got really curious, and I was just obsessed with knowledge. So I was always, every time my boss had a meeting, I was finding out who it was with and then reading up on that person. Every time a script came in, I would read the script. Every time paperwork was going back and forth, I would look at it just so I could try to understand it. I bought books on film business. I tried to read books on things I didn't fully understand very well.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another reason that working at these lower levels can sometimes, as long as they at least allow you to pay your bills, they afford you a lot of time to learn. When
Right.
you start, when you're an entrepreneur and you just start your own company, a lot of people are working 20 hours a day, and you don't have time to just stop and read, a really helpful book
Right.
or learn within the safety net of a job,
Right.
as opposed to when you're having to generate your own activity. So that really helped me a lot, was just the fact that I had the opportunity. I was just married. So I was, I would come home at night, we would have dinner, we would hang out together. And then I was, staying up later, just reading books and reading scripts and reading. I had the ability to do that because I didn't have the pressure of running my own company. So
Mm-hmm.
that's another benefit of kind of working your way up as opposed to starting.
Yeah, that's a big point, because when you're not running the show, you're not accountable for the end product as much as 2 or 3 pegs on the ladder up from you, right? So there is the opportunity to fail more or learn more just on the fly. It would be something that I'd say. You mentioned one thing that I wanted to key in on. We also talk about the millennial thing, is you mentioned that you had this season of entitlement. Would you mind digging into that a little bit, or saying, here's what snapped me out of it at very least?
Yeah, I think that there was about a 6-month stretch
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of it, ironically enough, had to do with some of the same things that a lot of millennials are struggling with today. Is I would get addicted to, I would like fantasy baseball, fantasy football. The internet came in, around 93, 94. I graduated college in 97, and I was, it was starting. So by then it was starting to really grow. And I think my sports obsession started to come back because of the accessibility of the internet.
Right.
I've always been a procrastinator. And I am a creative at heart. And so creatives tend to be a little bit more loose with their schedules. I've discovered this even in my 30s and 40s, that my biorhythms are way better at night. I mean, if it was up to me, I'd be awake from 5 in the afternoon till 5 in the morning, as opposed to the other way around. So I was always a little bit of a man without a home. So here I have this job where you're supposed to show up at 9 and work till 5:30.
Right.
And you had to report to someone. And I was always, even in college, kind of the leader of every group I was in. So it was hard for me to, I think, to adjust to the structure of things.
Yeah.
And so for 6 months, I think I was just, a bit of a lazy, a lazy guy. And my procrastinating mindset didn't quite work with their system. And so basically, I mean, I got jolted out of it because I was threatened. I mean, by the sense of, they were just like, this isn't working. And, we don't want you around if you're not going to, pick up the pace. And I just realized, I was embarrassed, and I was, I think embarrassed was the best word for it. And I wanted to, it kind of just revived all of my instincts, which I think were to work hard and to earn my keep. And so I just turned it around. I just turned it around overnight, and within a couple months got a 25% raise, got a promotion. It all came together really quickly because I was a talented person. I just wasn't utilizing it. And I think once that threat came, I got off my butt and started to really try to prove myself valuable. And it led to me, I had this mindset of, if I can become invaluable to where they need me around, they'll pay to keep me around, and they'll give me more access to keep me around. And so I tried to not only fill in my own weaknesses and turn them to strengths, but I tried to look for the weaknesses of my boss, maybe the knowledge gaps he didn't have, and become adept at those so that he would want me around to fill in his own gaps. And that's what happened.
Yeah. So you say two words that stick out to me, and they are embarrassed and potential. And so I think that in every young professional's life, there's this moment where they're exposed for whether it's entitlement or inexperience or incompetence, any of these things. And we had a guy on this podcast probably 6-7 weeks ago, and he was like talking about his first time at a job where he didn't know what he was doing at all, and he was embarrassed. And the kind of what comes out of this is, you can't be embarrassed for very long. It has to come to a breaking point. Like there must be a clock somewhere where you can say, all right, I'm embarrassed, and it starts. And then by the time the clock is up, you're either a wrecking machine, and you've spun everything around, and you become an adult out of it, or it turns you into an infant, right? You curl up and you go away from the challenge. And I think if you're a young guy watching this and saying, hey, yeah, Dallas Jenkins, he's made some films, and I'd like to be just like him, or I'd like to do something just like that, realize that moment is going to come. And I think that one of the things I love about doing this podcast is I get to hear those stories that, I've got you up on IMDb here, and you're the first guy ever on this podcast with an IMDb credit, by the way. Is that, those stories aren't told. All we see is that you get awards, and you've done great in the box office and all these types of things. And I think that's just something that you do have to realize as a rite of passage along this journey to, wherever you want to go. And then that potential piece is, you can be something, but you're not being it. And that should trigger something in you before you're embarrassed. And the guys that get it right, and I asked the question about, like, could you have made Hometown Hero at 22 or 23? And you answered no, is to say, if you had done something different, or maybe come to that point earlier in life, maybe it was a potential for it. But then I also asked that question because there's a lot of kids that think they don't need to go through it. And so what they end up finding is that they do need to go through it. And then they get to this point of embarrassed, not fulfilling potential, feeling entitled. And that it comes one way or another. So it's like, deal with it as soon as you can. And maybe working at a company as the lowest man on the totem pole is the way to get it.
Right. Having some of your failures and realizations come when the stakes are a little smaller. Right. Is way better than when you're at the top or trying to build a massive business, or trying to build any size business, when all the responsibility is on you. Making a big mistake has even bigger stakes. And so by being willing to work on the farm, I learned a lot of these lessons even when I was on the farm. just failing or being embarrassed, and then at Blockbuster Video, at every place that I've ever worked, I've had that moment where someone above me has pointed out that I was difficult, either because of my personality, which I think I was always a little bit of a, pushing back on authority a little bit. I was always a little bit more of a loose guy. But literally every stage. And then, I remember, and I'll skip ahead for just a second here. I remember in 2010, when I actually went to work at Harvest Bible Chapel in Chicago, having been on my own and with my dad for 10 years, I had another experience of having to learn a lesson of how to defer, how to, go by someone else's schedule, how to be, someone who could work within a system and work in a corporate environment when I had kind of been my own boss for a while. I had to have another embarrassing experience, and had to make a shift again. And at every stage you have to decide, am I going to learn the lesson and adjust, or am I going to plow through it and assume everyone else is wrong but me?
Right.
And I think you have to have a little bit of everyone else is wrong but me attitude to even want to do something entrepreneurial in the first place.
True.
But you are collaborating, and when you are working with other people and you do need them to accomplish what you need accomplished, you absolutely have to adjust in some way.
That's a great point. It's funny because it's almost like, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, it seems like there's this, the embarrassment or the awareness that is drummed up in these hard circumstances is almost the currency for competence, right? It's like, if the bill comes, and if you want to be what you're wanting to be, like, you almost have to have had some of that going on to be able to fill that bill. So the other thing is, I wanted to take it kind of like, let's move the story along to, a little bit closer to where you're at now. You've had the resurrection of Gavin Stone. You've had some other things go out. You had, it's not Bret Hart, it's Bret Michaels. Yeah. Shawn Michaels. I'm sorry, the Heartbreak Kid, not Bret the Hitman Hart. Which, if you grew up in the '80s, you know who both of these gentlemen are. So tell me like what you've had going on recently, because it sounds like, as I watch you on Facebook and Twitter and so forth, you've got a ton of cool things going on. You've been traveling to Israel. I watched all of that. You've got some side projects going on with other people. Can you tell us what's going on? Yeah,
ironically enough, you bring up Resurrection of Gavin Stone, which marks what is probably my biggest career downturn. My failure, as it were.
Right.
Because yes, the opportunity with the Resurrection of Gavin Stone was significant. I got to work with some amazing people. I was in business with some of the biggest and most successful production companies in Hollywood, who wanted to make this movie with me and wanted it to be the first of many. The plan was to do, over the next 10 years, multiple movies with me at the helm. Seen my work, they loved my work, they loved the project, they were all in. And we're talking about, Academy Award winning, multi-million-dollar companies that were excited about this movie. And the movie came out opening weekend and bombed.
What's bomb for us that aren't in the industry?
So the opening weekend of a movie kind of at the box office dictates, typically dictates how successful it's going to be.
Okay.
So we were expecting and needing the movie to open up at like $3 to $4 million in ticket sales.
Okay.
And it opened up at 1.2 million. It opened up at less than half of expectations and need. And so within a couple of hours, all of those companies that had been intending to make future movies with me were no longer an option for me.
Gotcha.
They basically said, we dipped our toes in the faith-based waters. It didn't work for us. We're going to go back to doing what we are best at, and you go back to doing what you're best at, and we'll go our separate ways. They weren't mean about it. It was just, it didn't make sense for them to keep trying faith-based movies when it wasn't their main thing, and it didn't work. So I was at essentially a crisis point in my career, and that ultimately led to I was, working at Harvest Bible Chapel in Chicago. My primary job there was to make films and to make short films and videos and media content.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I made was a short film about the birth of Christ from the perspective of the shepherds. And while I was making that, I was realizing this is what I love doing more than anything else. I feel like this is in my wheelhouse. I feel like it also, when I'm doing it, I feel most comfortable. I feel like I'm at my best when I'm doing it. And so I thought of the idea of a television show that was like a Game of Thrones style show, but during the time of Christ. And it's never been done before. There's been movies and miniseries about Christ and the disciples, but never an actual multi-season show that you can binge watch and look forward to future seasons and really get to know the characters.
Okay, cool.
Well, I came up with that idea, and there's a streaming service called VidAngel, VidAngel.
Okay.
VidAngel. Long story, I'm not going to get into all the details, but they saw that project, that short film that I did, agreed with me that it made a great pilot episode for a series. Were blown away by the concept, blown away by the short film. So I left my job at Harvest for many reasons, but what ended up happening was we bought that film back from Harvest because I had done it when I was there,
Mm-hmm.
and released it on Facebook and for free to people to gauge their interest in potentially helping finance this series. So it was essentially crowdfunding on steroids, where the idea was...
I love anything on steroids, by the way.
Yeah. Yourself.
Maybe not. I don't know, Dallas.
Let's hope not. That's why you were so angry on the court.
Hey, well, hey.
So crowdfunding is typically done on a relatively small scale. Like it's usually someone trying to finance a project for $10,000 to $50,000, and in exchange they're offering T-shirts and little opportunities. This was actual investment. And VidAngel said we're going to offer people the opportunity to actually literally invest in this process, in this project, where they can buy shares of the company. So we did what's called a testing campaign, just test the waters, where we released the pilot episode, and we said, if you're interested, just let us know, and let us know how much you might be interested in investing when it comes time for that. And 13,000 people pledged millions of dollars, and the reaction was so strong that the pilot episode was played all over the world, and the reaction was really guttural and emotional, and people were like, we want to be part of this. And even those, obviously the majority of them didn't choose to invest or choose to pledge to invest, but the reaction was so strong, we knew we had something. And so
right.
Then we take all those pledges to show the SEC that there's interest, and we did what's called a Regulation A investment opportunity, which launched literally 2 weeks ago. So we went out 2 weeks ago back to some of those pledgers and said, hey, look, it took 6 months. It was a long process, of which I was essentially unemployed, which wasn't fun. But we banked, a lot on this project, and we think it's going to be...
Can you throw numbers on it? Because last I saw it was at 1.5.
Yeah, so right now it's at 1.7 million in actual investments, and we've been using these 2 weeks to kind of work out some kinks. So it's been going slower than the pledge round, obviously, but also there's just been tons and tons of roadblocks, whether it was, just even in the last 2 months, my family and I have had more health crises than we'd had in 20 years combined.
Oh, wow. I thought you were going to say with the SEC, because they'll give you a nice roadblock.
That too. So
right.
I'm just starting, believe me, it's a long list of issues that I think are part of, any time you're doing something that may be important. You just face a lot of roadblocks. I think even spiritually speaking, I can say,
absolutely,
someone who is as a born again Christian believes in the spiritual and believes that a project like this could potentially have a lot of impact, and so potentially there's also a lot of resistance to it.
Absolutely.
So, leaving that aside, just even dealing with the SEC can oftentimes feel like a spiritually depressing period. But anyway, we're now officially launched, and people can, if they are, what we do, the cool thing about it is we're able to say, you don't have to trust us that we're capable of pulling this show off. You can watch the pilot episode. You can watch something that I did that's 20 minutes long that we shot on a farm in Illinois for on a shoestring budget, relatively speaking, to what television shows normally are. And when they watch it, are very profoundly moved. That's been the vast majority of people who've seen it. They can watch it for free. And then if they think, well, this is just something I want to watch with my family when it comes out, they can do that. Or if they think, I actually think this is going to have some financial or even spiritual impact that I want to invest in, they can invest. And if the show succeeds, they succeed. Obviously, everything's risky. There's no guarantee of return. But if the show is successful, they will also be financially successful. Or they can just choose, if they want, to just have the money stay in the show and have it have impact around the world, spiritually or emotionally, like it has been. So,
yeah, that's a really interesting structure for a Series A, and that's why I bet the SEC is interested, because they're thinking, okay, so we've got non-accredited investors pooling at a clip of 13,000 different investors. So the average in there is what, like 10, 20 bucks?
No, the minimum is $100.
Okay.
And right now, after the first couple of weeks, the average has been about $1,000, maybe $1,200. Now, that's with a few people who've invested $50,000. There's a couple $50,000 investors, a couple of $25,000, a few $10,000, and then the majority of them are $100 to $500.
Yeah.
So we really want to invest.
Is this still available? Like if I'm sitting out in the internet ether right now and I'm saying like I saw that Chosen thing. It's 20 minutes long. It's really well done. It's like a timepiece, and it's biblically based. Obviously, time was early AD or some like right around then.
The birth of Christ. It's about the birth of Christ from the perspective of the shepherds, and so I think the reason that it has done so well, and it's even doing well as we kind of are putting it back out there in the last weeks, even though it's not Christmas time, is encountering Christ from the perspective of those around him, as opposed to the typical Jesus movie or Jesus show where it feels very formal. Jesus is portrayed as someone who's kind of a King James Bible quoting, blonde-haired, blue-eyed white guy who's quoting scripture. This felt very authentic to people. So yes, right now, literally as we speak, investors are coming in. And
is there a cap?
Oh no.
Okay.
So we've had a couple people who pledged or who were interested in investing anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million, who right now are obviously, now that we're in the actual investment stage, they're going over it with their accountants and their legal team and all that kind of stuff. We're happy to just keep going and just only, if all the investors were $100 to $50,000, that's fine too. But the point is, it's an actual investment opportunity. And there's also people who say, listen, I don't care about the investment. I don't care about the return. I just want it to impact people. I just want to be part of this process.
Absolutely.
We believe this is going to impact the world. So,
well, it's really high quality stuff. And so like, even since you and I have been talking relatively near term here, as I checked this out before we hopped on today, and it's like, it's world-class level stuff. It's like, you could turn on HBO and think, and line this up with any other programming that's out there and think this is right on par. And I think for any creator in an endeavor like yours, like if you can stand your creation up against the Evander Holyfields, Muhammad Ali's of the media world and say, I can't tell the difference, like that's major thumbs up. So I can't give you enough credit on that.
Well, thank you. But I think I think some people may think, well, how would I do that if I didn't have the money? I mean, Game of Thrones spends $5 million an episode.
Is that true? Good night.
Oh yeah, and the budget for the pilot episode that people can watch now was $100,000. So it was, a 1/50th or whatever of of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, less. We'll go with that. It's a lot less.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have my numbers in front of me, but
no problem.
Yeah, that's right. I was thinking 500,000. So 1/500th, is that
closer? Yeah.
So anyway, the reason that I think when you watch it, you don't see the difference production quality wise. I think if you watched it with Game of Thrones on one television and my thing on the other, you'd eventually realize, okay, the money for Game of Thrones is going towards wide shots and big expansive things that are more expensive. But when you're watching, and the reason I'm getting into this is because I do think it applies to any kind of business, media or otherwise. When you're watching my pilot episode of The Chosen, we stay in our lane. We don't drink wine on a beer salary. And what I mean by that is, if I tried to do a bunch of wide, epic shots of cliffs and deserts and crowd shots where there's thousands of people, it would look like a cheap version of an expensive movie.
Right.
Because I contained the story. I contained the story into a marketplace, the inside of a temple, of a small temple, a group of 4 guys on a hillside at night. You're only focused on what you can see. You're not thinking, wait a minute, there's no big, huge crowd scenes. Wait a minute, there's no big cliffs that and wide, epic shots and special effects that I should be seeing.
Right, no Night King.
Yeah, you're concentrating on what you can see.
Right.
And so in any level of business, media or otherwise, if you can maximize and be great at whatever small container you are putting your project into, feels like it's the best of what it is, because you're not looking like a poor man's version of something bigger. You're just looking. So the story, I kept the story somewhat contained, and it feels like a movie or a show that's on par with what you'll see on television, because we're not exposing what we didn't have, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a huge thing then, because I do some side projects, and I think it's so important to not try to swing out of your league, right? So like, don't fight out of your weight class to stay on the boxing term. So like, you see yourself up against Game of Thrones, the budgets are obviously different at this point. You've got to prove yourself if you want to get in those outlets. And so I found this to be something that has paid significant dividends in my creative endeavors, and that is to do something simple extremely well, and then when you compare it to what else is out there, like some of the software stuff I've built sits on the same architecture as the other guy, but I'm doing it at a much smaller clip, but that all sits underneath the hood, and it's cloud-based, so I only pay for what I'm using, is the other play on this. So I think that's really interesting, and I think I've been having more conversations with creative people than I ever have before in the scope of this podcast, and there's just so much that lends itself to both areas in terms of like how things should be done, how to execute. And I see your stuff, and that, like when you're saying like we focused on one frame in an enclosed area with only so many people, so that when you compare us, we're not trying to be that. And I think that's huge.
You use it real quick. I'm going to use your analogy. I'm going to start using it more often, that you intentionally or unintentionally use, which is if Floyd Mayweather fought Evander Holyfield in their primes, Evander Holyfield would have massacred him in 90 seconds.
And he might massacre him now. It's like that difference in weight is that big of a difference.
Right, but Floyd Mayweather is pound for pound one of the greatest boxers of all time.
Right.
In his weight class. And so I've never used that analogy before, but it's a great one. Is I would argue that, as this may sound self-serving, but I would argue that The Chosen's pilot episode is pound for pound one of the more impactful things you'll see. I'm saying that based on others' responses. I'm proud of it, but I don't want to sound arrogant, but I'm just saying pound for pound, I think it's strong. If you put at the Emmy Awards Chosen's pilot episode up against Game of Thrones would massacre us, because they spend, as you adroitly pointed out, 500 times as much money as we do. And so, but the goal is for the series is to find that middle ground between what we did last year and what Game of Thrones is, and then eventually grow into something like that if it's as successful as we hope it can be. But we're not, even as we're raising money for this, we're not trying to raise $5 million per episode. We're just not, we don't think that would be actually prudent to our investors. We're trying to, again, just build one block at a time, own the space that we're in at each level, and then grow from there. So again, I apologize, I interrupted you because I liked boxing analogy so much, but I think it's such a good principle.
No, I think, and this is all about this is all about us learning from each other and all the people listening learning from you. So you're right on the money. You can interject however you like. One other thing is, you've got The Chosen coming out. We've got the Series A round funding. Is there a link we can get a hold of if someone's interested in getting involved, or even we're saying this stacks up nicely next to other production quality stuff out there. I want to go validate it. Where can we go click on that stuff?
Yeah, so thechosen.tv. So
okay.
www.thechosen.tv.
Mm-hmm.
Watch the pilot episode. You can watch the video that we made giving the details of the whole process and explaining the need and the opportunity that people have, the opportunity that I think is there for a project like this, the reason why audiences are so intent on it. And then, there's also a link to just watch the pilot episode. That's what we usually want people to do anyway.
Yeah.
Found over the 6 months that this has been going on that the conversion rate is way down when we're just pushing people invest now or check this out as an opportunity to invest.
Right.
That doesn't work as nearly as well as, hey, watch this, you may enjoy it. Getting people to watch the episode and they have an emotional response to it, and that emotional response then leads them to want to know more, to see how they can be involved. But again, I think that's another business principle is, again, if you're trying to raise money or trying to convince someone of something,
mm-hmm.
I'm reading a really good, I just finished actually a really good book. It's about the power of story. And it's by the guy who runs Mandalay Entertainment,
I'm losing his name too. We've had folks on this podcast talking specifically about the power of story before.
Yeah.
One of our sponsors is Story Leaders.
We can't take a break. I'm going to actually, because this is important, so I'm going to look it up.
Yeah, fire it up, man. We got a minute.
Peter Guber, that's his name.
Okay.
So Peter Guber wrote a book.
How do you spell Guber?
Guber.
Okay.
And it's called Tell to Win. Tell to Win. Connect, persuade, and triumph with the power of story. And Peter Guber was a extremely successful producer, and he owns a venture capitalist company. He owns a bunch of stuff, and he talks about in the book how he had to learn that the best way into someone's pockets, much less their hearts, was to tell story, and the power of story worked infinitely better than anything else he was trying, any of his persuasion techniques. And so I think, again, the story of The Chosen, not only my story of how I came into it, it has been a compelling story for people.
Right.
How it was birthed out of a significant failure. But also the pilot episode is a story. The story of the birth of Christ, told in a unique way that's never been told before, impacts people. And they have become, as a result of it, wanting. I mean, we hear from people who are like, I don't have much money, but I want to be part of this because I want to impact spiritually the world.
Right.
And it's what convinced VidAngel to get involved. Is they watched it, there were tears streaming down their face. They said, this is why we built our company, was for things like this. So the power to tell a story, I think even if you are an entrepreneur who's not in media, you might want to partner with someone, or at least talk to someone, not me, but like me, who's a storyteller. And even if you want to make a video, like a 5-minute video with a storyteller like myself, or you want to just consult with someone on how to best tell my story.
Well, with the dollar, yeah.
That's even valuable in a meeting that has nothing to do with media.
You know, it's funny because this is something I've been kind of talking about for years in my space, and I'm in enterprise software sales and things like this, is to say you need to learn how to tell your own story for it to be authentic. So,
Sure.
Yeah, a great start is to consult with a great storyteller. I had Ben Zolden on this podcast. He wrote a book called What Great Salespeople Do, and it's all about being able to tell a great, authentic story. Because the world as it is now will spot a fraud quicker than I think it ever has before. And so if you come to these meetings with an
agenda,
an emotionally charged like fake story, it will fall faster than your, what we call in the business, show up and throw up slide deck. Here's slide 2, 3, 4, all the way through. Because if it's not real, then it's garbage anyways. And this spawns one more thing I want to ask you about, is I've spent probably a good part of the last 2 years studying archetypal stories. And so whether you believe in the Christian faith or not, these stories have tremendous generational power. Like you can say that this, that, or the other about any religion, but these stories have lasted thousands of years, and there's a reason for that. And if you look for the archetypal themes, like you can find these components and put them into, or like have them fit your stories. And so to take from these, great stories of the past and make them current, so powerful.
All of that is Joseph Campbell, who I've read and who I've watched. He did a series of interviews on PBS.
I'm not familiar with him.
They were significant. I mean, that's surprising that you're not familiar with him because you're speaking the language that he kind of created.
Oh yeah.
He has his very seminal work was called. It was by Joseph Campbell, called the Hero's Journey.
Mm.
And the Hero's Journey is pretty much gospel for a good chunk of the creative world and a good chunk of the thought world, the spiritual world. And it's all about these archetypes. So that's really interesting that you brought that up without having read him, because he's he's fostered a lot of this notion of myth and archetype and the stories that have changed the world over centuries, and how you can utilize that in your business, whether you're in the media field or the writing field or not, because ultimately storytelling is
what people respond to. Yeah. So let me ask you this. I bumped into the archetype thing by stubbing my toe on it for enough times and then turning on the lights and looking at what I was kicking. So it's like, oh my goodness, that's what that is. And that's something that takes a long time. And so if you're sitting here watching this thinking, what are they talking about? Like, read some of this stuff. It's really powerful. What I would love to talk to you about is, so you created all this content, and one of my life goals is to do a documentary. And I've got some ideas on what on. And so and this is something I hear from lots of people. So now we've got the expert on the phone here, and we're going to ask about how would you start if you wanted to create a documentary on a shoestring budget?
Well, the beauty of today's media world is you can do it on a shoestring budget. I would do one of two things.
Okay.
If I couldn't raise money in advance, if I couldn't even get $20,000, which I think somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 if you're wanting to make a documentary that could potentially go on Netflix or something or whatever, even just get into a film festival and get some attention.
Where does that 20, 50 grand go? Because like I'm sitting around in my office here, I've got 3 cameras, I've got the ATEM Blackmagic television studio HD. Like I feel like I've got all the stuff I would need, and that cost me maybe 5 grand. Is this like for plane tickets or distribution costs? Where do those dollars go?
Yeah, so there's marketing costs. So let's say you just spend $5,000 strictly on equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the time to interview people and get decent interview footage. you have the time to find pictures and imagery that
like
will
cutaway media. Yeah.
Yeah. We call it B-roll, which is footage of. So let's say you're interviewing someone about their experience in the war, and so then you want to use whether it's archived footage of war footage, or I'm just making this up as we talk, but
Yeah.
If you have the time to do all that on your own, I suppose you don't have to spend any money. But I would say if you don't have any money, like to do it, if you don't have the $20,000 to $50,000 that goes towards, well, okay, so I got ahead of myself for a second. So once you're finished with it, just even the cost of getting it into, applying for film festivals so that you're hoping that it starts to get a reaction. You want to know if it's any good.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes those costs start to add up. Flight costs to meet with potential distributors. You could do a documentary for nothing if you really wanted to. Typically, though, you just got to spend a little money. So, for example, I have a friend who reached out to me for help with his documentary that he was putting together about.
I bet you get that call so often.
Yeah, I do, and I don't mind consulting, but he was actually wanting me to even potentially co-direct.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, just sometimes you have to hire an editor. It's just someone who's going to assemble the footage for you. For someone who doesn't have any experience with an editing program, again, you have to buy the software. Typically, you want to, even if you could pay someone $5,000, which is relatively low if they were going to put a month or two into it, but there's just always some cost. So let's say though that you don't have any of that money. At some point, you finish your documentary. At some point, you're going to have to try to get it out to the world.
Exactly.
Yep. Costs a little bit of money, but I find that again, the best documentaries that have been really successful started with, again, curiosity. Started with someone like yourself who maybe wasn't experienced. There's a podcast, a true crime podcast, that I got addicted to, that a bunch of people did.
Yeah, that's a famous one, yeah.
Called Up and Vanished. And there was a podcast called Up and Vanished that was started by a guy who just, again, had rudimentary recording equipment and was just looking into, the mysterious vanishing of a girl in Georgia 10 years ago, and just got it out there, and it just started, it blew up. It just started, because he was discovering things as the audience was.
Mm-hmm.
And so, he's going to turn it into a documentary. Part of that was the reason he was doing it was a documentary. I think podcasting is oftentimes a nice training ground for documentaries. If you can just start recording yourself, interviewing people, recording yourself, exploring the information you're looking for.
Right.
It oftentimes leads to other things, and it oftentimes leads to other people wanting to be part of it. So, again, if one of your life goals is just to do a documentary, and you don't care whether it becomes uber successful or if it's on Netflix or Amazon, you're just wanting it to at least break even. Again, oftentimes knowing in advance where people would want to watch it if they could.
Right.
So if you're just like, I just want to do a documentary on, Charles Spurgeon, one of the heroes of my faith, the audience for that will probably potentially be Bible classes in colleges. So,
well, I don't consider it a documentary unless it makes it on one of the major outlets, and that's, I thought you were kind of parlaying into my next question. Is like, say I get this thing made, and how do people go and get content on Netflix and Amazon? Because before I did this podcast, I assumed that getting something on iTunes was almost inaccessible. But then, come to find out, it's not so hard. So, can you outline that process a little bit?
Yeah, it's getting it something on a free platform is not that hard. Netflix, of course, you would have to finish the documentary. I would advise that you submit it to some film festivals, and you'll know pretty quickly if it's good.
Okay.
And if it's getting some attention, and at these film festivals, even if it's getting accepted into film festivals, that's a good sign. And so that, I think, is important before. And so if you can start to rack up a few awards or some attention, then some of these opportunities, like a lot of times a gatekeeper, a distributor will come along who has a relationship with Netflix, and they'll say, I think my person at Netflix would like this. There is a submissions process, but they get a lot of submissions, so that's kind of hard. But if you're able to come at them with some information, like this has been accepted to a dozen film festivals and it's won these awards, when you've got something that's actually good, attention comes. It just does always. It just does. Okay. And those to whom it doesn't, and I'm included in that. I've had some things that I put out to the world that just I thought were going to do well and get some attention at festivals, and they just didn't. And I was like, at first going, I guess, it's just they have too many things. They didn't give it enough attention. Ultimately, though, it just wasn't good enough.
Right.
It wasn't as good as I thought it was.
Yeah.
And things that I've done, like The Chosen's pilot episode, where we put it out to the world, and it just, you could hit the refresh button, every couple minutes, and the numbers were climbing. Whether it was views, or there was a period of time when people were pledging, where I would hit the refresh button, and the numbers would go up in terms of how many people were actually taking the time to fill out a form and indicate their interest. They were going up by the tens every couple minutes.
Awesome.
So clearly I was able to go, this was good enough to get reaction. So by the same token, when I had done something similar and put it out on Facebook or put it out on YouTube or whatever it is, and you hit refresh and the numbers aren't moving, it wasn't good enough.
Yeah, it's hard to come to grips with that, because you create something that's your baby, and the world doesn't always like your baby, and that's just reality, I could fill up a legal pad with all the ideas I've had that are just garbage, or I could fill up a full page of legal pad with ideas that I've actually tried to execute on and have fallen flat on their face. And I could fill up this Post-it note with things that have actually worked. And so it's a numbers game in a lot of ways. And I just think, like, when the world looks at this, I call it like a funnel. Like when you put all the things you think in this funnel, and then two things come out that actually were any good, then it's a very humbling thing, because it's very easy to think that everything you think is brilliant. And so in the same way, you get phone calls about, hey, look at my documentary. I get that same call about, hey, I've got this piece of software I want to write. And I'm like, yeah, it's been done 15 times, or you could do it, but there's no way you're going to be better than this thing or that thing.
Or you can tell, I don't know how this works in software, but in movies, obviously, I can watch something. Like I've told people this online, I've told on social media, I won't read your script. I don't have time to read scripts. Come to me out of the blue. But I'll watch anything you send, at least for a few minutes.
Okay.
I can tell within 90 seconds, tops. Typically, I can tell within 30 seconds, but I'm going to be generous.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell within 90 seconds if something's good or not.
What are you using to cue that off? Are you talking about, like, does it quality come into that, or are you just like, this guy?
Quality, how the camera is framed. Framing. Whether it's just, again, the storytelling technique.
Mm-hmm.
For someone like myself, and I'm sure this is true of you in software, some of it you can't even quantify how you know. It's become such a DNA, you just know. You and I can step on a basketball court, and you've played pickup games thousands of times. Someone walks onto the court, you can tell you can oftentimes tell by how they walk whether they're going to be any good.
It's true.
When they shoot their first shot, you immediately know this guy is at least capable, or whether he's, sometimes you can even tell if they're amazing, but for the most part, you can tell right away. How do I know? The form, how he carries himself, how he, even when you throw him the ball, how he catches it. With movies, there's things I can't quantify on a podcast.
Gotcha.
But just right away, I can go, oh, this person has something. And I can tell you that it's been 2 or 3 people out of 1,000 that I've thought this person has a career in this. And those people have ended up having careers. But the vast majority, it's just, okay, you're passable. I'm not even trying to sound snarky. or negative. I'm just saying most people aren't capable of making a living making movies and television. Most people who are even pretty good aren't capable of making a career. I'm only making a career out of it because a few things have worked out well, but I'm not considered like uber successful by any stretch of the imagination. The fact that I'm able to make a career out of it and have been able to support my family is in and of itself miraculous.
Mm-hmm.
My last feature film was a failure. And we're still having this conversation because I've been able to make a career out of it. And you've deemed me worthy of your podcast because I've made a career out of it. But you're talking to someone whose last feature film was a bomb.
Yeah, that's not indicative of the future, though. And I think that, and I'll bring this back into my court, is I've seen guys get the big job, like the VP role at, I used to work at Amazon, so I'll use that one. The big job at Amazon, and that's the logo, that's the Goldman Sachs of tech right now. Or if you want to even say Goldman Sachs, right? You get the managing director job at Goldman Sachs. And I've seen guys get into those roles and fail miserably, but there was something about them that got them to that role in the first place that affords them another chance and another chance, and it depends on what kind of fabric they're cut out of, which will afford them chances until there's just no more companies to work for. And I think there's tremendous beauty in that. So, like what prompted me to get you back on the podcast here was I saw that The Chosen had raised $1.5 million on a video outlet platform that I hadn't heard of. So something special was going on here. And yeah, I mean, man, good luck on that. That's so cool that you're doing that. And like we said earlier, if you're wanting to see this or compare it to some of the other stuff that's out there, thechosen.tv, is that correct?
Yeah, and what's interesting is I hit the refresh button when I was just giving you the website. And we did raise another $15,000 in the last half an hour.
Good for you, man.
So that's again small compared to what we're ultimately going for, but just show there is activity happening, so that's nice. But yeah, thechosen.tv, thechosen.tv. If you go to that website, there is a couple links. You'll see it near the top. It just says Watch Pilot. Mm-hmm. You can click on that, and it's just 20 minutes. And anyone who's potentially interested either in investing or in just understanding what it is we're talking about, you can just watch that 20 minutes and see if it impacts you. And if it does, you can either become someone who enjoys it when it comes out on streaming, or you can invest, or you can curse the day that it was created and wonder why Lee even would have a moron like me on his show.
Those are all options. What I would tell you is, another thing is that if you're sitting here watching thinking, I would love to have a career in television or media or movies, this is one of those things that is a rite of passage. And we say that word a lot on this podcast is, yeah, Warner Brothers might not be interested in talking with you, or Fox, or whoever else the other guys are. And I was just saying, I'd like to make a documentary. And yeah, Netflix and Amazon probably aren't going to be interested in what I have right off the bat. But there's a chance, and you won't know unless you show up and you swing the bat, is what I always say. So yeah, I think this is a very cool thing, and I'll be watching it as it goes forward. I know the brains that are watching this podcast right now are thinking, okay, so if Dallas just raised 15 grand while we were on this podcast, is my shares getting diluted? Do I have to come to the plate with more than $100?
Yeah, a good question. No, the shares are not. The shares are broken into a defined amount, and so you can increase your number of shares, but they don't get diluted.
Okay. So Series B guy isn't going to come in and make my share go to 0.1%, right?
No. So yeah, yeah, good question though. But yeah, no, it is an interesting opportunity because if the show is successful, there really is a lot of potential, because this show is not only going to be distributed on a VidAngel streaming platform in the United States, but it's going to be distributed all over the world on multiple platforms.
Yeah. Is this going to find its way to a Netflix or an Amazon?
No, because VidAngel is, they're a filtering service. So the reason you get VidAngel now is to watch Netflix shows with your family, and you can filter out bad stuff. So, for example, a show like Stranger Things, which is a huge hit on Netflix, but my younger kids couldn't watch it because there was some other stuff that just weren't family friendly. For $6.99, $7.99, I think you get VidAngel. You can literally watch your Netflix shows through VidAngel's platform and choose to get rid of the S words or the F words or whatever it is. And like for myself, I hadn't watched Game of Thrones because obviously there was, from what I'd heard, a lot of nudity and
it's pretty graphic, yeah.
So now my wife and I are binge watching it through VidAngel because we just literally went in and filtered out nudity. And I know the common joke is, well, that only leaves 5 minutes for Game of Thrones, but it actually, isn't that bad. And so now we're loving. It's almost like watching the TV version. And you just get rid of the nudity, and now we can really love it. So that's how they've been primarily operating. So this show is their first piece of original content. So how Netflix used to just be doing movies and TV that other people produced, they produced House of Cards as their first original series, and it launched the platform in the stratosphere. Same thing with Hulu with Handmaid's Tale. So that's what they're doing with The Chosen. The Chosen is going to be their first piece of their first original series.
Oh, very cool. I did not know that. Okay. So good for you, man. That's pioneering right there. And that alone is enough to get you on this podcast. I'm not trying to hear you say that I made a bad podcast selection guess one more time. How about that, Dallas?
All right. I'm sufficiently punished.
Well, perfect, man. I appreciate you coming on, and we'll make a habit of doing this because I'd love to hear how things have gone with this in the future. I'll ask you on air here, will you be our resident media experts to tell us what's going on in the world of media?
It's interesting. I already actually I'd love to. I actually do that on there's a radio station in the Midwest that's pretty big, and they have me on every week, literally just to talk media trends, make recommendations for families. So I love doing that kind of stuff, and so absolutely, let's make a date of it, just to kind of regularly talk about media things, and then hopefully next time I come on, I'll be hitting the refresh button again, and we'll be at the $3-4 million mark, and that can be our own little story.
Well, welcome to the show. The pay is zero.
Well, hey, listen, man. If I'm raising $15,000 every time I come on, I'm happy to do this daily.
Hey, well, we'll have you. All right, Dallas. I appreciate your time. We'll talk soon. Thanks for coming on.